This lecture should serve as an introduction to your reading of two Arthurian stories. We call them Arthurian Romances, and I'll explain what that's about. We're reading the story L'Enval by Marie de France, and we are reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is by an unknown writer who is often simply called the Gawain poet. Arthurian romance is an entire genre of British literature, and even goes into literature that is written about as far away as Sicily from England. It is a subject that recurs particularly in the earlier portion of the Middle Ages over and over again, and is somewhat sentimentalized in the late Middle Ages as a kind of heritage. Understand that we have no evidence that King Arthur ever lived. I hope we find it. That would be amazing. We have different stories that might be attributed to somebody who stood up to the Romans named Arthur, but we have a whole lot more evidence of a woman named Boudica who stood up to the Romans with an army than we do of a King Arthur who did. One of the things that Arthur heralds in his legends always is a code of chivalry related to knighthood. And it was a technological development the same way jet fighters have been in our era. The idea that you could fight while sitting above the enemy was such an advantage. And the idea that you could control a horse in such a way that even in the heat of battle, the horse would obey your commands, that took a lot of skill. Arthur was an emblem of a legend for a standard that was upheld throughout English history and even in French history as well, for a kind of gracious military prowess. Arthur is even recalled in the royal wedding that happened this summer. I don't know if you saw Meghan Markle get married. If you saw the video from start to finish, you saw a bunch of people that had red robes on that were directing people, kind of like ushers. Those were the Knights of the Garter. They are referred to directly in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the Queen still has knights from this group. Now, they don't operate in the same way as Edward III's Knight of the Garter 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, it's pretty impressive that this tradition still has resonance today in England, in the current monarchy, because of the standards that were set in an Arthurian romance. And a romance does not mean, oh, I fell in love. It's not the same thing as I'm going to go watch a rom-com romance. Romance is simply refers, if I were to take away these two letters, to roman, which is the Anglo-Norman word for a story, basically. A story that is told at some length, like a novel. Today in modern French, that word means novel. So an Arthurian story does a variety of things that you see in both of our readings. First of all, it combines, an Arthurian romance will combine supernatural elements and political elements. Much of the discussion is of Arthur becoming king and how he will hold on to power as king. And the very fact that his knights are of the round table always, we don't think of this as a big deal. Why would we care if the table is round or square? It doesn't seem to make any difference. But the idea of a round table meant that this was a king who listened to the nobles who fought wars for him, that he wasn't just a dictator, that he would actually take advice from the people who were the ones who were risking their lives for him. It's not a democracy, but it is not something where the king makes decisions independent of the people who sustain him in his kingship. And this is why the fact that it's a round table seems to matter. So these are all political elements to the stories of Arthurian romance. But there are always figures in these stories who have supernatural powers. In the earliest versions, we have Arthur obtaining his power by divine right through a lake goddess. She shows him a sword, Excalibur, that he will then be able, after seeing this vision, to pull out of a stone where it is supernaturally embedded, making him the selected leader selected by the gods. And as Christianity becomes increasingly the religion of England, those elements are subsumed in other things. Merlin in the earlier versions is kind of a hero. He's a little enigmatic. He's a wizard. He's kind of a hero. He does good things. But as Christianity begins to question the whole idea of warlocks and wizards, he's suddenly not such a great guy. There's a character named Fata Morgana who appears in old and new versions. In the old versions, she is always super powerful, really on Arthur's side. She is a supporting character who is seen as doing good. And as Christianity begins to suggest that Fata Morgana, who is always portrayed as having witchcraft powers, she's seen then as a satanic enemy. And also, even there's one element that appears over and over again in later versions of the Arthurian legends, which is that Guinevere cheats on King Arthur. Queen Guinevere cheats on King Arthur. But that didn't happen for the first several hundred years of telling these stories. So somehow women got less trusted in the middle of the Middle Ages. Something went wrong for women in the Middle Ages, and it's reflected in the Arthurian legends. Arthurian legends are episodic, and here's what that means. If you read a comic book of Batman, for instance, you don't have to have read every last one of the Caped Crusaders' crusades in order to understand that Batman is fighting the Joker. We know he's a character who appears from time to time in his stories. And so each episode stands alone as its own kind of story. And we might not automatically know, unless we are massively into Batman comics, which episode came before another episode, because ultimately the Joker will break out of jail and he'll do something else bad, and they'll set up the bat signal and Batman will have to go get the Joker again. That happens as an episode over and over again in different permutations. And likewise, Arthurian legends always have similar stories of one of the knights of the Round Table was riding through the woods and he encountered another knight, and this knight insulted him and they got into a fight. And then they rode off in separate directions after one admitted that the knight from the Round Table was thoroughly the winner of the fight, and the knight of the Round Table was courteous in a chivalrous way. And this happens over and over and over again. The good news I have for you is that the two versions that we are reading of the Arthurian legends are not boring like that, where we just like, oh my God, are you going to fight? Yes, they go in the woods. Yes, they have another fight. And so what? In fact, the authors of these works have more to say than that. The characters in the earlier versions of Arthurian legends are what are called typological, meaning it's not like a deep psychological portrait. It's not like we ask ourselves, you know, what's the backstory of Sir Galahad? I mean, what really makes this guy tick? I mean, really. Tell us about, like, why he is Sir Galahad the Chaste in a really deep way, and how does he feel about it on a daily basis that he's the Chaste? No, it's more like any knight will almost do. It is a two-dimensional character that allows us to do other things. It's kind of like Batman and Robin. It's not like you can go to a conference and discuss what is the real nature of that kind of unusual relationship that Batman and Robin have. I mean, what's really going on there? But mostly you don't need that in order to understand the Batman comics. But in L'Enval, And in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we have a somewhat more developed image of the characters. And one of the reasons for this is that the writers happen to be excellent writers. Marie de France is this amazing writer who is trying to say something beyond simply, yes, a knight of the court of King Arthur did some stuff. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is evidently very interested in the court of Edward III and not so much in King Arthur's court, which means that in these stories, in different ways, there is a criticism of the government by proxy. Let me explain what that means. Today, thank God, we live in an era where it is possible for anyone to criticize our president. Whoever that president is, I love that we have free speech. I don't care if you like this president and hated the last one, you hated the last, or you love the last one, but you hate this one. I like that we can talk about it. That was not true in a medieval kingdom. You cannot just stand on the steps of the palace and shout, "The king is awful." You will get yourself killed. And not just killed, I mean, they will go medieval on you. It is really, really bad. So let's say you are close enough to the king and you have some legitimate concerns about how things are going in this society. Well, you can't say, what's wrong with you, king? Did you not take your medication today? You are just so whack, it's not even funny. What, are you stupid? You can never say to the king, what's wrong with you? Are you stupid? So what you can say, though, is you can tell the king a story. And here's how that story might go. Let's say the king is having a problem in the kingdom and you think he's mishandling it horribly. And you have the ear of the king. You can go talk to him. Well, and let's say he even has the ability to ask you, well, how do you think I'm doing? Aren't I doing a great job at this? It's not that you're going to say, yes, my king, and I'm not going to question it. You would say, well, your majesty, it's interesting you bring that up, because there was once a perfect great king, King Arthur, who had a very similar problem according to legend. And here is how he handled that problem. So rather than saying, king, what are you, stupid? You say, your majesty, I have all the respect in the world for you. But we all learn from the greats who come before us, like great King Arthur. And King Arthur had your kind of a problem. And here's how he handled it. And it went really well, according to the way I tell the story. And it allows me to enter into a deeper conversation about a problem in the country that I would never be allowed to have that conversation with the king, because it would get me killed. So those are some of the things I would have you know about Arthurian legends in general before you begin your reading of these two Arthurian legends. Arthurian romances, I should say. And I hope you enjoy them.